Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey everybody, and welcome to today's session, Supervision of Reentrants into Tribal Communities. I'm Travis Johnson, your moderator for today's session. I'm a Grants Program Associate here at the American Probation and Parole Association. We're joined by the Honorable B.J. Jones, Executive Director of UND's School of Law, Tribal Judicial Institute. Just so everyone knows, the recorded version of this webinar will be made available on next week on YouTube, and you can find that link on the APPA website if you want to watch it again or forward it to a coworker. Feel free to do that. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to state this project is supported by the Bureau of Justice Assistance. The Bureau of Justice Assistance is a component of the Department of Justice Offices of Justice Programs, which also includes the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the National Institute of Justice, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, the Office for Victims of Crime, and the SMART Office. Points of view or opinions in this document are those of the author and do not necessarily represent the official position of policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. With that, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. The Honorable B.J. Jones has over 25 years experience as a tribal judge for various tribes in the Northern Plains area. He currently serves as Chief Judge for the Sesseton Wahpeton Ayotte and its treatment court. In addition, Jones teaches criminal law and jurisdiction in Indian country and has a seminar on the Indian Child Welfare Act at the University of North Dakota School of Law. Jones has presented over 200 national and regional conferences since 1995, including the Indian Nations Conference, Department of Justice events, United States Federal Courts conferences, Federal Bar Association events, and National American Indian Court judges. Justice Jones also serves on North Dakota Supreme Court's Tribal State Judges Committee. And with that, I'll hand it over to Mr. B.J. Jones.
Hey, thank you so much, Travis, for that introduction. And I want to also thank APPA and the National Judicial College for sponsoring this event. And I particularly want to thank all the participants. I'm going to talk primarily from the perspective as a tribal judge. And I know for many years as a judge, I thought the most important part of our justice system was to punish offenders, hold them accountable. And I never really looked at that other perspective of how do we welcome people back into the community after they've made amends for their criminal conduct. And I think especially in tribal communities, if we are believers in restorative justice, that we really need to complete that circle by bringing people back, giving them the chance to redeem themselves for their behavior. And we really need to develop programs that can welcome them back with a chance for success. I know that as a judge, I'm going to talk about my experiences at Sesseton Wahpeton. We have a program we started a few years ago where we work with the state of South Dakota to allow the tribe to supervise people coming back from state prison. We have our own tribal parole officer. We started this because we were quite alarmed at the high revocation rate for tribal members coming back into the community on parole. Many of these tribal members were revoked for losing contact with their parole officer and for other violations. And the tribe became concerned that perhaps if the tribe provided services to community members coming back, that maybe the revocation rate would go down. And so I'll talk a little bit about that program as we go through the slides. I want to leave some room at the end for any questions that may come up. Overall, I want to just emphasize the importance for tribal communities to be prepared for people who come back into the community. And as I go along, I'll talk about some of the things that we've done at Sesseton Wahpeton and other tribes to ensure a successful return to the community, and also talk about some of the resources to access. So, okay, and so basically the overview of the webinar, I want to identify some of the issues that are unique with regard to tribal citizens that come back to the community. One of the unique things about supervision of people coming back into tribal communities is oftentimes they're being supervised by a state jurisdiction that may no longer really have authority over the person when they come back into the community. And I think this is creates a unique problem for native reentrants because many times they have the perception that once they get back into the tribal community, they're beyond the jurisdiction of the state. And this may give them this false sense of security that while on the reservation or while in Indian country, they may not have to comply with state requirements. And this oftentimes leads to higher revocation rates for native citizens who come back. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But I also want to talk about how some federal and tribal laws that apply to people with convictions may impact reentry services. Some of these laws are pretty severe with regard to what types of services tribal members may access. And lastly, I think in this slide, I want to identify some resources that the tribe can access to make reentry successful for tribal members coming back. So that's sort of an overview I want to talk about. When I talk about reentry into tribal communities, I think there are two key issues we have to look at. And one is how to prepare people for reentry. One thing I noticed as a tribal judge is that many people who come back to the tribal community have outstanding legal issues with the tribe itself. So I've seen a substantial number of people coming back from institutions, federal or state, that have outstanding tribal warrants or outstanding tribal child support warrants, for example. So what we did in our community was to task our public defender with the responsibility of contacting people who are about to come back into the community to see if we can get their warrants cleared. And many times this would involve having them plead to crimes that they had committed before their placement outside the community into institutions. And we would generally give them concurrent credit on those sentences. That way they can come back to the community with a clean record. It's discouraging when you get out of an institution, a state or federal institution, and then you go back to your own community. The first thing that happens to you is you're reincarcerated in your tribal community for outstanding warrants that existed prior to going in. Also, with regard to child support warrants, as we all know, just because you're in an institution does not mean that your child support obligation ceases. So many of the offenders who come back may have substantial child support obligations, and there may be warrants for them. So we've also worked with our child support enforcement program to ensure that there's a way that person can come back into the community and not immediately get arrested on those types of warrants. So preparation is a big part, I think, of supervising reentrants. Okay, the next slide, Travis. What is reentry? I think this is important to understand because as Indian tribes, we may actually have tribal citizens coming back from various governmental institutions. We have people coming back from federal prisons. We may have people coming back from state facilities. And then for Indian tribes that exercise long-term sentencing under the Tribal Law and Policy Act, or under the Tribal Law and Order Act, oftentimes we have people coming back on our own sentences into the community. For example, I know at Sisseton and Wahpeton, we do exercise felony sentencing, and we have authority to sentence people up to 9 years. When they go away, though, they're sent to usually BIA facilities quite distant from the reservation. So we have to be prepared to deal with all these individuals coming back into the community. There's also people coming back from treatment facilities, mental health facilities. And even though we don't have clear statistics on this, I believe generally there's a disproportionately higher number of people returning to tribal communities from institutions. I base this upon the fact that in many state facilities, I cite here Alaska, the Dakotas, and Montana, Native people are 10 to 11 times more likely to be incarcerated. As a result, this is a huge population of persons who eventually come back to the tribal community. We also have what I consider an entry issue with regard to Native people coming back. These are folks who maybe never lived in the tribal community, but because they are looking for resources or family to support them, are now coming to the tribal community in search of those resources as a sort of a second chance, second opportunity. So we also have that as a unique issue in tribal communities. Next slide, Travis. I think before we can develop a reentry plan for citizens coming back, we really need to look at what are their issues, because we can't develop a plan unless we have an idea of what are the barriers to successful reentry that are out there. And so I went through and looked for statistics that are particularly applicable to Native prisoners who come back. I know there's a lot of statistics related to all persons who return to the community, but I wanted to look at specifically what are the characteristics of the reentry community in tribal communities. And here are some issues that I think we have to look at as members of the tribal justice system to respond to people coming back. One of which is the mental health situation. I mean, statistically speaking, almost half of persons who come back to the communities have some ongoing mental health needs. And we really need to respond to these. I know the Indian Health Service has not always been an organization that has responded well to mental health needs. Most of their resources go towards physical issues, but I think we need to prioritize mental health issues in reentry if we're going to have successful reentry programs. Secondly, and this is a critical issue, I think, many of the people I see going to prison now from tribal communities or from outside their reservation have victimization issues themselves. One of the statistics I saw recently is that young Native women are more likely now to be incarcerated in many states than any other group of citizens. I particularly see this in North and South Dakota, where a lot of young people are being committed for methamphetamine charges. Many of these individuals themselves have been victims of crime. And if we don't have some type of counseling services available for them, they will not be able to really respond to their addiction problems. So you need to address those victimization issues. Another big problem I think we have is a lot of citizens who come back to the community simply don't have an education that will allow them to obtain employment that's going to make their return successful. I'd give a statistic here that 40% of inmates lack a high school education. And because they come back sometimes as convicted felons, they're less likely to get job interviews. So how do we respond to that problem too? And then the other thing that it's really a concern, I think, in tribal communities is that we have high numbers of revocation rates for persons coming back to the community. I saw a report from the Office of Minority Health that said that half the persons who are released from institutions return to those institutions within 3 years. And this is a specific reentrant. So we have to respond to that. And a substantial number of these folks come back and they really have no place to live. I'm going to look at the next couple of slides, limitations on where they can live because of their status. So we got to be responsive to that also and sensitive. And then I mentioned this before that 62% of reentrants have issues with delinquent debts, warrants, costs, fines owed to the court, or many of them have child support warrants or obligations that have not been met. And again, there's nothing more discouraging to someone who's trying to make a successful reentry into the community than being arrested within 1 or 2 days of their return. So it's an issue we have to respond to in tribal communities and develop resources, develop programs that can give people a chance to return without immediately being arrested. Okay, next slide, Travis. As we all know, there's a lot of baggage associated with being a convicted felon. And this type of baggage is a major obstruction to creating successful reentry programs. And I cite a few of the statutes here, a few of the federal laws that may very well impact or impede a successful return. The Native American Housing and Self-Determination Act, like many low-income housing programs. Many of these programs prohibit certain convicted felons from living in tribal housing. I think currently the restriction is on people who've been convicted of felony drug offenses. And I see this particularly with methamphetamine. If you have many states make methamphetamine a felony offense. So if you come back to the community being paroled on a methamphetamine charge, many communities you cannot live in tribal housing. This is a major problem because in many tribal communities, tribal housing is all there is. There's not a big private market for housing. So we have to work with our housing authorities to ensure ways of getting around this to assist these folks. There's also the Sex Offender Registry Notification Act. Many tribes run their own registries. These persons who have been convicted of certain sex offenses, of course, cannot live around children, cannot live within a certain radius of schools. So that's another issue that we have to look at. There's also a law that was just passed in 2015, I believe, or 2016. Many tribes are not aware of this law. It's called the Native American Children's Safety Act. This is a pretty onerous law that imposes some limitations on where convicted felons can live. And the reason I raise it is many people coming out of institutions may want to return home and live with family members. Now, this law, though, would prohibit tribes from placing children into homes where there are certain convicted felons. Now, this law is still being interpreted. It's a similar law as states are bound to abide by, but the law, the way this law is written, it implies that a tribe may not place a child into a home as a foster care placement or a private placement if there's someone in the home that has a felony drug offense or a felony crime of violence. So we have to watch it when we invite people back into the community to make sure they have a home that does not have children who are placed there by the tribal court or by the tribal government. Because if we place those individuals back into those homes, it may result in children being removed from those homes. The other limitations may be under tribal law, federal law, and I think tribes that have to run these programs are bound by these federal requirements. The temporary assistance to needy families and the SNAP program, which is the food stamp program, may not allow persons with felony drug offenses to benefit from these programs. So these are all laws we have to take into consideration when we're creating an environment for people to come back to the community. Next slide, Travis. Oh, and I also mentioned Indian Health Service and Medicaid. There are also restrictions in those two programs. I mean, I know the Indian Health Service is trying to restrict access to opioids for persons who have a history of abusing drugs. And there's also restrictions under state Medicaid programs for persons who have been convicted of certain crimes. So in your community, I think it's critical to understand how these laws may impact return to the community. And you have to, in developing a program that will give the chance of success to reentrants, you have to consider these laws and how they may impact your reentry programs. Next slide. I think this slide's important to understand because I think there's a common misperception that the key to successful reentry is getting a job and finding a home. And if that's going to be the criteria to assess successful reentry for tribal communities, you're creating some obstacles, because many tribal communities, the unemployment rate is so high that the old idea that the real key to success for reentry is getting a job is going to present barriers to tribal reentrants. So I think for every individual, and I noticed that I mentioned our parole program at Sisseton and Wahpeton, what we try to do, and we have actually what we call a wellness team that works with parolees back into the community, is try to develop an individualized plan for each of these individuals coming back that assesses their unique needs. So there may be people coming back with some severe mental health issues, some severe substance abuse issues, and employment really isn't their key barrier to success. It's more of developing a continuum of care for these individuals who come back. So imposing upon them a duty to immediately find employment when the unemployment rate is so high may actually be setting them up for failure. So sometimes you have to consider employment as the ultimate objective. I agree it's important to successful reentry, but a lot of times people who come back first need some mental health services or treatment services before we can expect that they immediately gain employment. But that's not to say that everybody who comes back is going to need to complete a treatment program. There are good treatment programs in facilities. Many of them are not culturally based, but some of them are very successful. So it's important for us to develop individualized reentry plans for everyone who's coming back to the community. Next slide, Travis. I like to stress this, that the people who come back to our communities from institutions, they're not a hindrance to the community. Many of them provide a valuable service to the community. I've noticed in many tribal communities, for example, the best treatment providers are people who have lived that life of being an addict. May themselves have been in institutions because of drug or alcohol addiction, but now they're mentors for others in the community who are coming back with this problem. I know we've had successful youth programs in some communities I've worked in, where some of the mentors are people who have criminal records, and they, speak from experience about what drugs and alcohol will do to young people. So I like this quote from Loretta Lynch, that working with individuals who come back into the community is not just helping those individuals. In many ways, it's completing that circle of justice and allowing those people to lead meaningful lives in the community and help others. And it's always interesting to me that a lot of the young people that maybe go to a prison for drugs, alcohol, other offenses, many of them really have no connection to their culture, and they sort of have a cultural emergence while incarcerated. And it's sort of a sad commentary that people don't learn their spiritual practices or their cultural ways until they're incarcerated. But I've met many a person who's come back to the community more aware because of the experience they've had in institutions. And they come back and they're very energized. They want to live that traditional way. And it's important that we give them options and alternatives, that they can pass that on to other tribal members who are searching for that in the community. So we shouldn't just look at reentry as a big burden on the community. We should always look at it also as a possibility of providing some benefits to the community for people coming back. So that's a good way to look at reentry as mutually beneficial both to the reentrant as well as the community. Okay, next slide, Travis. I think when you look at what are the keys to successful reentry, I believe you have to mobilize financial resources and human resources to develop individualized reentry plans for folks coming back into the community. One thing that I think we need to do better in tribal justice systems is to give tribal members who've never really been involved in the justice system some input into it, because a lot of what justice is trying to make people live healthy lives now. And the best way to demonstrate that is to bring healthy people into the programs. And we've tried to bring in elders who have, never drank alcohol or used drugs in their whole lives, but they can be valuable persons in this effort to bring people back into the community. And I list here some programs that we can utilize. Tribes that run GED programs. Again, many of these people come back, they don't have an education. That's going to be an impediment to their future. So if the tribe runs a GED program, that's a way of getting that person an education. I mentioned drug courts, healing and wellness courts. At one time in our tribal parole program, as a way of giving people who come back into the community some objectives, some programs in life, we've allowed them to participate in our drug courts. Many of them went to prison because of drug and alcohol abuse. So, and even though some of them may have gotten some services while incarcerated, maybe these services aren't enough to strengthen them when they're released. So we have a healing and wellness court, we call it a treatment court. And many of the people who come back from prison, they're permitted as part of their parole supervision to run through this program, do all the things in the program, get a sponsor, complete certain spiritual requirements. And oftentimes many of them, when they graduate, become mentors for others in the program. So if you have a healing and wellness court in your tribal community, maybe you can look to utilize that for reentrants who come back. We also have to ensure that mental health services are provided. And the Indian Health Service, there are a couple of lawsuits that were brought against the Indian Health Service, one I think in Montana and one in South Dakota. They're older cases, but in both cases, the federal courts ruled the Indian Health Service has a trust responsibility to provide for the mental health needs of tribal members. And historically, though IHS has been weak in this area, it's difficult to get counseling services for things like post-traumatic stress, for bipolar, for other issues that may be affecting folks coming back into the community. So we have to make sure the Indian Health Service is holding up its end of its obligation to provide these services. If you have a tribal community college, what options are available there? Is there some technical assistance? Is there some training there? Is there some certification? I know many tribal community colleges in North Dakota, for example, have welding certification. And that allows people who come back to the community to get trained in a particular field that may lead to some employment. I list some other programs there. Many tribes have departments. Now, understand that most of these probation departments are designed primarily to work with individuals convicted of crimes in the tribal system, but there's no reason that they also can't work with other tribal members coming back from other systems. Now, I realize this puts quite an onerous burden on probation departments, which are already overworked in tribal communities, but it is an option you can look at. Perhaps you're in a community that has traditional groups or societies in the community, men's societies, women's societies. Maybe that's a source of services for reentrants. And then there's always spiritual leaders. I've noticed that people who are incarcerated, oftentimes the part of their lives that's really least exercised or least recognized is spiritual part of their life. They really have no spiritual life, and sometimes they discover it while in prison, and they come back into the community looking to nurture that. So we have to look at those folks too. But the key is developing, mobilizing services in a way that there can be successful reentry into the community. Next slide, Travis. And don't overlook the possibility of federal, tribal, or state tribal collaborative approaches. Most states will tell you they do not want to reincarcerate people in their institutions. It's expensive. States are strapped for resources. And if there are other options that could be utilized, many states, the federal government would like to do that. So you may want to turn to your state government or even the federal government if you have a lot of reentrants coming out of the federal system and see what's there. Maybe you may be from a tribe where you have a lot of state parolees coming into the community. Ask the state, what kind of services can the state make available? I know that South Dakota has 2 parole agreements, one with Standing Rock, one with Sisseton-Wahpeton, where they actually pay for tribal parole officers. And the tribe gets to make a determination whether to revoke parole. So this is a program that I think benefits both the tribe and the state. The state doesn't want to revoke people, send them back to prison. It's too expensive. And the tribe doesn't want to see its citizens re-incarcerated. So this is a program that's been fairly successful. I don't know how it's gone at Standing Rock, but I believe other states want to extend these programs to tribal communities. Look at other programs that are available in the state services. Maybe they can be utilized for reentrants. I talked, some states or tribe may provide domestic violence batters re-education. That could be a program that could be made available either through the state or the tribal government. So always look at that as a possibility also. Next slide, Travis. There's human resources and then there's financial resources. And oftentimes reentry programs are not successful unless there's some financial resources that can be brought to bear. And I did a little research to find out what possible programs are there for tribal communities. And here's some possibilities. There's something called the Second Chance Act. No, not many tribes take advantage of the Second Chance Act, but it is available for state, tribal, and local governments to develop reentry programs. And there's a hyperlink there to a website that talks about the Second Chance Act. Tribes have to start applying for these programs too. Again, these programs are supposed to be there for tribal governments. But many, I think, tribes feel that because it's a program that they have to compete against larger governmental jurisdictions, states, cities, they don't have a fair chance for this. But many tribes are funded under this, so it's a possibility. And there have been 800 awards in 49 states, and the Bureau of Justice Assistance provides awards for adult reentrants, OJJDP for juvenile reentrants. So it's a chance for both juvenile and adult programs. And I gave you the hyperlink to last year's solicitation. I think the solicitation for next year may be posted here soon. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and apply for that. Next slide. If you have a situation where you have violent offenders coming back into the community, that's extremely difficult. It's difficult not only because some of these violent offenders have some severe mental health issues, but it also creates some tension in the community because the community may be fearful of people coming back who have violent histories. And so there are unique special services offered through SAMHSA grants, which many tribes receive and are eligible for, to deal specifically with violent offenders, especially in the area of mental health needs. Again, many of these offenders have mental health issues that are not being addressed in the institutions, and they're not being addressed outside the institutions. And unless they're addressed, they may continue to be violent individuals. So SAMHSA does have a grant specifically for these folks. Tribes are eligible to apply. I'm not sure any tribe has successfully applied for one of these, but the money is there. The money is tribes are eligible to receive it. Next slide. The Department of Labor has programs, work programs for persons coming back into the community. Again, tribes are eligible to apply. Not many do, but don't forget that possibility also. Some of these programs could be funds to tribal community college to provide specific educational resources for those coming back to the community from institutions. Yeah. And the last source of funding on the next slide, Travis, is what's called CTAS. Many of you probably work with tribes that receive these grants. It's called the Coordinated Tribal Assistance Solicitation. And there are at least three categories under CTAS where tribes could possibly get reentry grants. The most common one is Category 3, Tribal Court Assistance in Indian Alcohol and Substance Abuse Prevention. I think there's numerous tribes that have applied for this category, focusing on reentrants. And I'm going to talk, the last slide, I'm going to give you an overview of some successful tribal programs. But don't also forget about Category 4. Category 4 is called the Tribal Justice System Infrastructure Program. Many tribes have used this category to renovate facilities, renovate halfway houses, provide for transitional living units for people coming out of prison. I know there's several tribes now, White Earth of Minnesota, I believe. And there's some other tribes that are using these Category 4 grants to renovate buildings that they're purchasing in order to make them appropriate for transitional housing from prison back into the community. So these are all programs that tribes can access in order to provide for successful reentry. Next slide. In here I give you some examples of programs that I was able to find a description of online. And I'll just briefly talk about some of these programs. Many of them are run through the Public Defender program for the tribe. For example, up in Montana, Confederated Salish Kootenai tribe has a holistic defense program. And the basic idea here is, instead of just providing services to defend someone in a criminal action, the idea is to identify the person and what their needs are and try to get resources to provide that holistic defense. Look at the person as a whole. How can the program assist that person? Nisqually up in Washington has what's called the Native American Reentry Services Program. And again, that's a program that's trying to provide a multitude of services for individuals coming back into the community. Standing Rock is an interesting program up in North Dakota. The federal government and the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe have a multi-jurisdictional reentry team. And this is an effort by Standing Rock to get the federal government to recognize that just releasing people from federal prison into the tribal community isn't their only obligation. They have an obligation to continue to provide services to those individuals released back into the community. So here the tribe and the federal government work together to supervise persons coming out of federal prison. The other three, the program out of Wisconsin, Muskogee Creek, and Alaska, are more specifically designed to deal with people coming out of state institutions. But they're all three programs that try to incorporate some cultural aspects as well as some supervision components. And they're all three very successful programs, because I think many states recognize that culture is a strong component to this, and that the only way to change people's behaviors and attitudes is to get them attached to their culture, get them attached to their families, and then that way it changes beliefs. And if you can turn someone from an unhealthy belief system into a healthy one, it oftentimes will result in success for reentrants. Is there any, I think that's the last slide, right, Travis? Oh, okay. Just a technical assistance slide here. If you're interested in reentry in tribal communities, American Probation and Parole Association currently has a technical assistance grant from the Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance, to work with tribes who are developing reentry programs. Perhaps you need a code drafted. Perhaps you need some training for your probation or parole officers. Or perhaps you need some, accessing resources. The APPA can give you an idea how to access resources. Perhaps you need some guidelines for, reentry programs in your community. All of these are available through APPA, so I would encourage you to contact Travis Nambanali, who works in this area, and they can aid you with resources to make your reentry program successful. Okay, I think that's the last slide. Okay, I think we were going to open it up to any questions from the participants. So I don't know how, would they just submit them in writing, Travis? Is that how that works?
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, just feel free to type them out in chat or raise your hand and I can message you, whatever you're comfortable with. We'll give you guys a few minutes to type those out and ask those. And if not, thank everybody for coming. Thank BJ Jones for giving another great presentation. Like I said, this webinar will be on YouTube and on our Tribal Repository website probably within the next few days or week. And on November 13th, I invite everyone to attend the next webinar in this series, November 13th at 2 Eastern. It's going to be Reentry in Indian Country Jails, Starting, Sustaining, and Overcoming Roadblocks. And that's going to be presented by our American Jail Association. So the link for that will be going out hopefully this afternoon or early tomorrow morning. So looks like somebody's got a raised hand here. Let's see.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And then I got a guy from Bayless. Will I get some more Bayless? Two jokers or one? Just one for now. And I have him writing reports. Yeah, okay. A report on it right now for this one. Okay.
Hey, BJ, I think we may have a question here from Mr. Mason.
Okay.
I'll send him a message. So. Oh, maybe not. That's from a while ago.
Okay.
Well, I guess we'll end it with that, guys. If anyone has any questions, as BJ Jones was saying, you're free to email me or my coworker Nan Benally here at APPA. My email is tjohnson@csg.org. I'm going to speak to this for a second. Mr. Jones was talking about applying for these grants, and one of the things we hear when we talk to BJA and some of our partners at the federal level is that tribes aren't applying for these grants, and they wish that they would. So don't feel discouraged in applying for one of the grants, because one of the things we hear is that we wish more tribes applied for it. So I just wanted to add on to that point. Thank everybody for your attendance, and thanks for another great presentation, BJ, and that's it.
Thank you all. Have a great day.